All right. So we are back for another Maxim Gorky discussion. Today we are discussing On the Steps, which is a bit of a shorter story written by Gorky in 1901. This is one that Ren actually recommended because I believe you have a hardcover of the short story or
I
collection.
do. And actually, it's funny if we could maybe even just start there. So, when I was looking for more information in terms of the background of this story, I noticed that it is not even included in his bibliography on Wikipedia. So, this is like truly like plumbing the depths of what he produced, I suppose.
Obscure Gorky.
Yeah, very obscure. And it's funny too because this collection that it's in that I have is called Great Russian Short Stories. And a lot of the other ones that feature in this are ones you would expect. You know, you've got The Queen of Spades by Pushkin. Let's see, who else do we have? We have a couple by Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy, and then out of nowhere, it's just this really weirdly obscure Gorky short story. So I kudos, I guess, to the editor for digging deep and finding something that probably isn't included, I'm assuming, in a lot of collections that are not just Gorky works. So I thought that was kind of interesting as a fun fact about this one.
And when did you or where did you pick up this collection?
I thrifted this at some point because when it comes to short story collections, sometimes I just can't help myself, especially if there's even just one in it that I feel like I would want, and then I just kind of have the rest of them sitting around. And since I'm a completionist, at some point I try to kind of go through all of them. And the reason that I picked up this collection was because of the two Dostoevsky short stories, which actually themselves are not big stories of his. Like one of them is Crocodile, and then the other one is A Gentle Spirit, which I think I've heard of more often than Crocodile. So that was the reason I picked this up in the first place. And so then when you were asking about like, oh, what would be another Gorky thing we could do, I just had some notion that he had a story in this. I didn't know that it was this. Yeah, that it was like deep in the lore of his writing. I had no idea it was that obscure, but here we are.
Yeah. Would you say it's a hidden gem of his, or would you say it's kind of like a mid? Would you say?
I think that in terms of his oeuvre and like everything that he produced, I'm not sure if this would be like, oh, top tier, you simply must read. But I think that coming off the heels of the lower depths and knowing that this preceded it, but not by very much, makes a lot of sense. I feel like not that the lower depths is the spiritual successor to this by any means, but definitely you can see thematically a lot of continuity. And so I think in that sense, it's kind of interesting. So if you are a fan of Gorky and of his preoccupations as an author, I think that certainly you would read this and be like, yes, that gave me the hit of Gorky that I was looking for. But if somebody had never read something by him, I'm not sure that I'd be like, you simply must read On the Steps. Um, I don't know. What were your general impressions? Because I know you also have read quite a bit more Gorky probably than I have.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those short stories which you're if you're hungry for something from this era that describes this era in an accurate way, it's something that you can kind of sink your teeth into. Um, and you are correct that it does kind of have the same sort of archetypes and themes as the Lower Depths does, or some of his other works like Mother. I
Mm.
just watched an adaptation of his book Mother, and it's that same the same kind of archetypes, which we'll get into later, like the tramp and these kinds of on the other side of the tracks types of characters. Um,
So my headcanon for this was I was reminded in the lower depths of the story that, and you're going to have to give me the character's name, but that the wanderer, like the older wanderer character,
mhm.
tells about how he was staying at like some kind of homestead or something, and he had these two tramps who show up, and in my headcanon, it's these two people that were the survivors of this story
Oh,
showing up at his that the whatever the homestead he was watching over was. I in my mind was like, there's the continuity. There they are. They've arrived, and then this is before they get separated or something. I mean, I don't literally think so, but I just did think it was kind of funny that he wrote this first, has these two tramps wandering off and all over the place, and then in one of the next things he writes, he has two tramps showing up in this
Oh
side
yeah,
story.
the Gorky
So,
verse.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the
Yeah,
Gorky verse.
maybe it's like a Stephen King situation where like everything is really connected to the Dark Tower. Everything is really connected to the lower depths.
Definitely. At least in my my lizard brain, that made sense. I was like, yeah, there's these connections here for sure.
No,
But anyway,
I like that because it in a way it does make sense because this is still Imperial Russia from that era. So all of these things are all happening on the map in different times and around the same time. So it makes sense. I like doing that with different writers and seeing it. Like, was he thinking about these characters when he was writing that? Because it's very similar to this. So with
yeah,
talking about um, more about On the Steps. Did you do any research about Gorky's personal life before reading this one, or after our first discussion?
yeah, so I did look at this a little bit, and I thank you for your notes and the biographical note in your notes as well. I actually would probably let you take that one just because I think that you had a more succinct notion of what the connection between his real life was and this. I had more luck, I think, connecting it to other pieces of literature from other places that it kind of reminded me of. But in terms of the biographical note, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, like so doing a bit of a backstory about I had a bit of a deep dive into Gorky during the pandemic. I just kind of read his entire profile. I watched all of these documentaries about him, and I found this Soviet film series about his childhood, Maxim Gorky, young Maxim Gorky, and recalling those films and his time as a child. I'm very much reminded of his kind of I like to call it his proletarian pilgrimage, and kind of finding himself after these kind of his bitter upbringing. He kind of finds himself in his youth on this journey, trekking through Imperial Russia, meeting these different characters. Um, and I can definitely see like all of that is very fresh in his mind when he was writing this and like everything that he's written. All the different people he met and experiences that he's had, and I guess trauma also.
Yeah, and actually it was interesting because I saw in your notes and I also kind of picked up on this that because of the just immense size of what Russia encapsulated in terms of cultures and different regions and how they looked, and noticing even within the context of such a small story the diversity of the people and the cultures being referenced that were all intermingling at the time. Very, very interesting. The times that he was writing in. I mean, even just the fact that you have these two, or I guess it's three originally, these three people tramping through the steppes, and just, being met unopposed. There's no border that they're crossing, really. Like just going across what was at the time like just one huge country. I mean, I think that that really, in and of itself, kind of gives you a sense of scale of the country at the time and just how far it extended and what it encapsulated, I think it's really astonishing to think about.
Yeah, the scale of Imperial Russia at the time, it's massive. Like they had Poland and Finland in there as well, which are huge, huge countries. Ukraine, of course, which is where this short story takes place
Mhm.
in um, in the steppes of Kherson, I believe.
It made me want to go there. Like I know that they were there under very
Mhm.
dire circumstances, but I something that really stuck out to me was this massive contrast between the beauty of the nature that he's describing in this and the peril in which they're living experiencing it. I mean, the way that he gets into what hunger feels like and how it affects these people is so harrowing, and yet they're always coming back to the natural world that they're living within. Talking about like looking up at the stars, just the again the scale of these mountains that they're tramping through, even the idea of like wanting to just eat the dirt. that they're walking across because they're so hungry. It's so tactile in this very natural environment. And that to me was probably the most compelling part of the way it was written, I think. That was the part where if somebody asked later, what did you think of that? I'd be like, I don't remember exactly the details of the action, but I would definitely remember the the majesty, I guess, that he imbues the natural world with in this. Really stunning.
Yeah, it's an interesting duality, I guess, that these types of archetypes or just people of that class level deal with
Hmm.
at the time, and I guess in modern times as well, living in such a beautiful country, but dealing with many harrowing sort of challenges, both economically and also socially, um, especially in Imperial Russia, where it was so diverse, like over 200 different ethnic groups, and the brutality of Russification in that era was very high, considering the diversity too.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but because I might be wrong on the timeline here, but is this not also, maybe this is slightly after, but I know that it was during that period of imperialism as well that the Russian language was standardized and that standardization was beginning to be enforced across the country and across the empire, right? Am I right
Y-
in that?
Yeah, that had been standard for quite some time up until this
Okay.
point, definitely.
I just wasn't sure where on the timeline that was.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it wasn't until like after the Bolshevik Revolution that that changed a little bit in some of the other territories, where more local language was promoted. Like, for example, in Siberia, many ethnic groups had their own alphabet for the first time in their entire history, which is when I first read that, it was just fathoming, it fathomed me that how strong the Russification was.
Yeah. No, it really strikes me too, like having traveled even just a little bit across modern Russia, the continuity of culture is like, I mean, obviously it's incredibly artificial, but it's also very, very striking, I think. Like, of course, people are different in different places and your environment shapes your experiences, but like it's just so shocking to be able to go from Moscow to Sakhalin and hear people speaking in exactly the same way, more or less, and having had very similar cultural inheritances. Very striking.
Yeah, I mean, Sakhalin, I guess, traditionally is was very different
Yeah.
than European Russia, of course. So, talking more about these types of characters outside of Gorky, what other types of characters and books did these types of characters remind you of?
Well, I know that we both had Jack London come to mind. Very specifically, it was pretty much at the top of my notes that I wrote, "Oh, this is spiritually related to The Sea Wolf" by Jack London. I feel like his, not the whole book. I had issues with the back half of that book, just for the record. But I think the front half of that book, when the protagonist is actually on the boat with these sailors and you have this stripping away of, I guess, of just kind of humanity in a sense. You're kind of stripping it back to this very base level of survival. And that kind of reminded me of this. It's a very unromantic, I think, view of what life is, especially I think in Gorky's case, it's sort of an imposed necessity for this lack of romanticization of life, whereas in Seawolf, it's sort of more self-imposed. It's like you don't have to be a sailor on a boat fighting for your life. But yeah, that just really reminded me of that. Especially there's a couple of monologues in the Seawolf. Have you read that one?
I have, yes, I have
Okay.
this really amazing collection of Jack London back in Canada. It's called Campfire Stories, and it had all of
Mhm.
these nature tales, and Seawolf is one of them.
I really and truly, that was the first thing that came to my mind because I just remembered this kind of grotesque, I guess, almost way that Wolf Larson, the captain character, talks about what life is and the meaning of life, and that life is just survival and it's literally just trying to live is the goal. And the way that these characters, there's a little bit of back and forth, I think, between their humanity that they feel for each other and about themselves. But there's a lot of interplay between that and their physical state of dying of hunger and starvation, and how that kind of strips back your the humanness of you in a way to just I need to eat something to survive. There's a quote, I think it's kind of towards the end of the story, where he says,
Mhm.
um, yeah, no one is to blame for anything because we are all alike beasts.
Yeah.
And this really, I think that more than anything was what I connected back to the sea wolf, was this idea of the base human condition being beastliness. And that all it takes is desperation and starvation and a lack of resources for us to revert back to that sort of more natural condition.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of this quote. And any man can be driven to brutality if the right pressure is applied.
Hmm. Very much, I think that's kind of what Gorky, what Gorky is implying. But I thought he made it more nicely complicated, because actually one of my problems with Seawolf is I think it's a very uncomplicated view of that. Like I don't think he challenges it really. Whereas in this one, I think there was a little bit of a challenge to that idea in the treatment of their fellow traveler by these three tramps, where like the protagonist, or I guess the narrator and the soldier character, are a little bit more unwilling, it seems, to give up their humanity ironically, than the student character. And I actually
Mhm.
thought that was a darkly humorous element of this. I think he had something to say with that. I mean, I know there is some question even within the narrative of whether that person had been a student, but I
Yeah,
think the
in student in quotations the whole time.
yeah. But I think even like the implication that the person who was theoretically coming from this like arena of education and like supreme humanity would be the one to sink the lowest into the depravity that they do. I just
Into
thought
the
that was
depths.
very, yes, so to speak. I thought that was quite funny, actually, in a very dark sort of way. But yeah, no, I thought that the shades of gray in how much of your humanity you lose in those dire moments, was far more compelling than what Jack London had to say about it in Seawolf to me. Um, I don't know, did it evoke any other things for you? I know you also thought of Jack London.
Yeah, I think it was a very interesting, um, I guess, portrayal of showing at first these characters have this sort of brotherhood between them and
Mm,
this kinship, being tramps and traveling together and relying on each other. And then at the end, kind of, like it reminds me of this other quote saying it's a bad winter when the pack is eating each other,
mm,
and the survival of the fittest mentality striking them. Um, because then, it's it's all one all for one kind of situation where you're looking out for yourself in that situation and
mm.
trying to survive.
Definitely. Although, again, I think he complicates it, at least in my mind. Again, only because in my brain I'm comparing it to Jack London specifically. But I think that it was interesting that for him, survival of the fittest had a very broad spectrum of what that could mean, because it didn't feel like at any point the fittest literally meant the strongest or the biggest. And so I thought it was kind of an interesting interplay, this idea of beastliness, but also human intelligence, because I have a feeling animals would not have handled this situation the way that these people do. And so even though the student is the one who ultimately succumbs, I guess you could argue, to that base animalistic instinct, and he murders this other traveler, um, it's not necessarily, again, because fittest means literally the fittest. He was just more willing to be cunning and duplicitous, I
Going
guess.
the farthest also.
Yeah.
with him.
Yeah, definitely. Because the other two, and certainly the soldier, seemed quite willing to just fold this guy into their group and, or at the very least, show some level of hospitality or just sort of like basic trust in him and to allow him to have basic trust in them that it's like, you can stay by our fire. You gave us your food. And like, yes, we beat you up a little bit to get more of the food, but we're not going to kill you. Whereas the student was more like opportunistic, I guess.
And there's one very interesting quote which I had, which I feel like Gorky is tapping into that idea about truth again, and maybe the comfortable lie, where
Mm.
it's they think they see the hills, but it's not the hills. Hills, exclaimed the soldier. It's too early in the day to see hills yet, my friend. Those are clouds, nothing but clouds. See how strange they look. They are the color of curdled milk and fruit. Do you think that's kind of tapping into the idea about truth and maybe some people trying to see things or seeing things the way that they want to see them?
Absolutely. And again, I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about the way that he depicts nature in this, is that there is something sort of tragically, I guess, human about trying to perceive the best out of your environment or out of your circumstances, even if there's very little to feel optimistic about or very little beauty actually in the circumstances that you exist within. And that's something that I actually, as a consistent theme in both of those works, I
Mhm.
find interesting. And I'm curious to hear from you. Is that something that he is very consistent about?
It seems to be something he's consistent about, not only in his prose, but in his own kind of
Mm,
speeches, you could say, or his own personal ideology, that there is an inherent optimism to
mm,
people for something better or just for base survival also.
mm. Although it sounds like from what little I know about him in a very like superficial sort of way, I find that interesting. Sorry, everything comes back to Dostoevsky with me.
Hmm.
But
Of course.
like it just, of course. But I actually find his vision of that so much more refreshing and certainly closer to my world outlook, I think, than Dostoevsky, who seemed to land on this idea that God was the only way that you could find hope in your life. And to me, Gorky said, which is a very esoteric view, I suppose, of like hope and optimism and beauty. Whereas with Gorky, he seemed more willing, at least in those two pieces, to engage with the notion that beauty and hope and optimism can be more tangible things in our mortal plane, I guess. And I appreciate that in his work, I think.
That he taps more into reality that can be kind of touched and built, whereas
Yeah,
Dostoevsky is maybe more philosophical and spiritual, maybe.
definitely. Like, I mean, even in the unrealities in the lower depths or in this one,
Hmm.
although this one it's much closer, I think, to physical reality, the beauty and the optimism that he taps into. But in the lower depths, even the unrealities that he's tapping into are still within the realm of possibility. Like you have the girl who's very invested in the love stories. I mean, that is something that you can experience, like in your life. And that there's only one character who taps into religion as the escapism from her misery, but she's also dying, which I thought was kind of added a layer to that. Whereas in this one, I thought it was interesting that at no point did these people think they were dying. Like they seemed to have this notion that they would find food somewhere, that they'd get out of it in some way. So I guess that also felt very anti-nihilistic in a way that was surprising considering the subject matter that he's covering in this, in the lower depths, and it sounds like in a lot of his other works. I find that fascinating that he was able to sort of stay above falling into that, I would argue, trap.
Yeah, I guess specifically talking about this story and these characters, it seems like, at least at the onset of their journey, they definitely expected that there was something on the other side of this journey, that it wasn't the end. And I guess would you say the same could be said about the lower depths, where these characters um, knew that there was something else on the other side of their misery?
I think that's the only way that I can reconcile where their optimism and their hope was coming from. Because I feel like if you don't think that things can get better, it's really hard to tap into an emotion like hope or optimism. So, in a way, I feel like even though they don't ever talk about the future in a realistic sort of way, they must have had the feeling that it existed for them. Otherwise, I feel like you do fall into despair. And I feel like that is sort of the difference that I sense between someone like Gorky and someone like Dostoevsky is I just never got the sense that Dostoevsky, regardless of where he landed in terms of God being the answer or whatever, like I just never got the sense that he thought things really get better. At least in life. Like he always seemed to land on the side of they don't. Unless you find religion, it doesn't get better. Um, and with Gorky, I appreciate that he seems to think like there is some value in holding on to hope, regardless of how dire it is. I mean, in this case, regardless of how they felt, they would have died probably if they hadn't come across this guy. Like if they were as starving as he's describing them as being and had gone so long, I'm like, no, there's no way that if they hadn't stumbled across somebody with food that they would have made it. And yet at no point did they as characters seem to give up. Like it didn't seem that surprising to them that they came across somebody with food to me. It was just sort of like, ah, yes, and here is the answer. There's this guy in the grass, and he must have more food, and he does. And like I just, yeah, that level of optimism I think is kind of an interesting trait, especially when you think of Russian literature, which I think broadly is considered to be depressing. I don't actually find Gorky depressing.
Yeah, I guess I'm seeing that in Gorky there's this recurring duality, which
Mm,
is empty in Dostoevsky. In Gorky, there are of course these dark elements, but there's answers and explanations to them and hope for something
mm,
better. Whereas in
mm.
Dostoevsky, it's more of a kind of a bleak, rigid depiction of these um, archetypes.
Very much so, very much so. And it's my understanding, again, I haven't touched on Tolstoy too terribly much either, but I also know of him that he, I think, is a more optimistic author
Yeah,
typically as well. Which again, it leads me to wonder where does this notion of Russian literature being depressing come from if unless it's just
just
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky. Yeah,
Like
because if you
he's
read
just so
Tolstoy, Pushkin, and Lermontov and Gorky, it's very optimistic and
Mm.
very beautiful language. Like Dostoevsky is to me the darkest um, of like the greats, if you want to call them
Definitely.
that.
Yeah, certainly. And I just find that very interesting that the more broadly I read within the Russian pantheon of literature, the less convincing I find that stereotype of the, or at least of that characterization of Russian literature
Mhm.
broadly. Like I think that Russian authors seem very willing to engage in discussions of suffering to an extent that I think maybe the writing cultures in other countries don't engage with suffering in that same way. But I wouldn't say that engaging with suffering inherently means that the outlook is bleak. Unless you're Dostoevsky, then it is. But like other than that, yeah, I think to me that's also been an interesting part of this exercise of reading Gorky, of reading these other authors and realizing like, wait a minute, just because they depict the lower depths doesn't necessarily mean they're wallowing in it.
Do you think there's a reason why Dostoevsky is promoted so much in the West as opposed to other Russian writers?
I think it's a combination of things. I think that on the one hand, I think that some of his novels, principally, I think Crime and Punishment, topically makes it an easier entry point because I think in some ways, especially just literature of that time period across the board, tended to be less plot driven anyway. And so I think the fact that that's a very plot driven novel makes it easier to get into. You can explain what it's about very easily and very simply. It's also not super dense in terms of the way it's written, for example. So I really feel like that is the one that catapulted him at least
Hmm.
forward in time. Because when you talk to people, I mean, most recently, White Knights became very, very popular. I think it was like the
Yeah.
number 4 most translated or always most sold translated work last year through the power of TikTok. Um, but even that one, I would say, like, I think that was kind of a fluke. I think that Crime and Punishment is the one that would have been the reason. And so, in addition to that, I think there's also maybe some, I guess my more cynical take would be like, it's more convenient to classify Russian literature that way because it gives it a an identity that's easily identifiable and to just say like, oh yes, Russian literature is like this. And if you're just taking that out of this one novel that is the easiest one to read, then of course that's the characterization I think you're going to come away with it from. But if you asked anybody who says that why they think Russian literature is depressing, it is probably because of that book or maybe other things that he wrote, perhaps. But I think like even something like War and Peace is not it's not cynical in that same way.
And I
I
suppose
don't
Dostoevsky being so celebrated in the West kind of adds added credence to the stereotype of Russia and Russians being super serious, super dark, and
That's
um,
yeah, that's kind of what I mean is it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like,
mhm.
well, of course, if you take the one guy, well, not the one guy, but like the big one guy who was
The guy
like
in the
that.
corner.
Yeah, if you take that guy and you say like, oh yeah, like the one Russian thing you've ever read is exactly those has exactly those qualities and you're just extrapolating out from that, then of course that's the conclusion that you're going to come to. But if the first thing that you had read or if the thing that you were more broadly exposed to didn't have those qualities, I just don't feel like that would hold up. But I think it's also easy to kind of wrap a lot of these other people into it because if you describe even this short story, what is this about? You'd be like, ah, yes, Russian suffering, you know? Um,
There's another one on the
yeah,
pile.
exactly. Yeah, and I think that there is a preoccupation with examining those aspects of the human experience that do kind of characterize Russian literature broadly, but I think that the outlook doesn't necessarily fit the stereotype in a lot of cases. Like there are some, sure, but like there are also a lot of others that I don't think do. Maybe One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich kind of fits into that a little bit, but I wouldn't swear to it. I haven't read it recently enough.
So there was one question I wanted to ask you about
Hmm.
this short story on the steps. At any moment, did you have to kind of put it down and kind of make yourself a meal? Because I'm reading it, I'm just like, oh man, I need to eat something because the description and the imagery of how hungry they were and the sizzling meat and the smoke and thinking about it just
Yeah, I mean, again, I think because this isn't a play, it really gave Gorky the space to do some of that characterization of these of the emotions like hunger, and I completely agree. I think it was super effective, and I can only imagine that this comes from personal experience, which it sounds like he must have
Mhm.
had based on what you're saying about his early life and biography. And yeah, very visceral description of hunger, very uncomfortable. Again, I just keep coming back to this idea of when he was looking at the dirt and just thinking
Yeah,
about how good it would feel to be able to put something into your stomach and not even thinking about how disgusting that would be or the lack of nutrients. It's literally just the feeling of something going
hmm.
into your
The
stomach being
desperation.
better. yeah, it was just so good. I mean, bad, but good. Like very excellent. And actually what that was the other work that it reminded me of in those descriptions was Knut Hamsun's Hunger, if you've ever read that one.
Yes, I've heard of it.
Okay, yeah. So I that one to me flopped where this one was successful only because in Hunger by Hamsun, it's a self-inflicted. Like there's no reason for him to be suffering in that way other than his own ego, really. Whereas in this one, I think it hit harder because even though the descriptions of hunger are equally uncomfortable in both cases, in this one, I just felt worse for these people. I was just like, wow, what a horrible thing to have to experience in a world where theoretically, like, there is so much opportunity to not go hungry. And yet here are these people carrying on this long journey across this huge expanse of nothingness, and they're starving. Like I was found it incredibly affecting. Absolutely felt it affecting. And
Yeah.
I was eating when I read it.
Okay, so you were satiated?
I was both literarily and physically, so
Uh,
I was doing okay, but definitely it made me notice the moments when I feel hungry after reading it a little bit for the next little period, because it's not something that I usually have to sit with, which is obviously a very privileged position to be in, to just be like, oh, I'm vaguely hungry, I'll go eat something. But
mhm.
sitting with that idea of like, but what if you couldn't, is so scary. And it just it's so heartbreaking to know how common it is to be a person in this world who cannot just be like, ooh, that's uncomfortable. I'm gonna go get a snack. Like, and you just can't, just like these people. And the pilgrimage aspect of it as well, I really is touching for me because I mean, talking about the migration crisis in our own modern day context, that also made me think of this when I was imagining people, um, especially making the sort of pilgrimage, the trek, the desperate journey up through Latin America to try to get into the US really evoked that for me too, where I was just like, I could imagine being in the desert and looking at the sand and thinking it would be so much better, surely, for me to just eat a handful of this than to starve. Even though the result would be the same, at least you'd feel better about it, I guess, or at least I could easily imagine that happening in that setting, in that context. To me, it was irrelevant that these people were criminals or however they ended up in these situations. It didn't really matter. I think that universal compassion for another person starving was captured very well by him here.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see what you're saying, where like something like this is a norm um, for people who are making that dangerous, life-threatening journey to reach, I guess, better economic conditions, of course.
Hmm.
And for myself reading it, it's very sobering for like our own kinds of struggles, like you and I living in some decent cities with good standard of living and thinking about them, but of course with our own challenges. Um, but reading this, you can kind of see like, no, there's like lots of people that have some serious things impeding them. And if you
Hmm.
were a peasant in Imperial Russia, this was a huge norm. And that's the majority,
Yeah.
it was the majority of the population at the time that had these kinds of harrowing journeys.
Hmm. And I guess to bring it all back home to roost, and I think this was in your notes as well. I and this also I think has crossover with the lower depths that I remember us discussing before, which comes up in this, which is this question of is this freedom? And
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting question, especially in this story. Like to me, in the lower depths, I would have said no. I don't think those people were ultimately more free. But in this case, it's sort of like circumstantially, in terms of the suffering that they're experiencing of hunger specifically, these people are experiencing that. The people in the lower depths are experiencing that, but their lives are so wildly different that to me, this story, these people felt more free to me than in the lower depths. Like when the soldier is looking up at the sky and talking about the freedom that he feels being a tramp, despite suffering starvation, I kind of believed it a little bit more, I think. I don't know. How did that strike you? Because this is definitely a consistency between those two tales.
Yeah, there's definitely truth to that. People who are vagabonds, they feel more liberation being outside of the city than being kind of meeting new people.
Mm.
And I guess it's a way to have more dignity to kind of being and traveling and seeing new places, beautiful places, and without the constraints of whatever life you may have in a city. I actually
Mm.
met um, this lady when I was visiting Portland, Oregon. And she was a bit older. She was on a pension. But she told me, she said, all I do is travel on the train and hang out in hostels all around the country because it's far more dignified than
Mm.
the places that I've lived in or the
Mm.
circumstances I've been in.
Yeah, and first of all, I think the fact that now this person in Port and not in Portugal, in Portland is having a similar experience to these people speaks again to this human truth, to this idea of travel being freedom and kind of no strings attached
Mhm.
and that sort of thing. All of those aspects to it, the romantic notion of that I can buy into way more than the lower depths. Like those people I felt horrible for because I was like, I get that you're trying to have this escapist fantasy that things will get better or that this isn't as bad as it could be, but it is kind of as bad as it can be. Whereas with these people, it does feel a little bit more like they had agency over this. So even though it's harrowing to read about them starving, I still felt like if you asked these people after death, if you asked their ghosts, was it worth starving to death to have this lifestyle? I get the sense that Gorky is kind of suggesting yes.
I'm
Um,
suddenly reminded of the movie Into the Wild with Elijah Wood, if you're familiar with it.
yes, I have seen. Yeah, yeah, very, very similar. Um, in the sense of it being a choice and a sort of act of free
Mhm.
will as opposed to
And
an
also
imposed
in spite of
state.
something that they've encountered in their past life too.
Yes, yes, yes. And like the contrast between those two choices that you can make of what to do with your life, I very much felt from this. I mean, again, it's complicated because as you said, like most people living in Imperial Russia lived very wretched lives. Like the material difference between what these people are doing and what those people were experiencing is not that different, obviously, in the sense of like, where's my next meal coming from? How can I literally live day to day? But the parts in between are wildly different. And it also makes me think of like unhoused people and how there's this dichotomy between people who end up homeless through life circumstances that they had no agency over versus people who, to an extent, choose that lifestyle. Like this woman you're describing in Portland. I mean, obviously she wasn't homeless, but I just mean I think that there are certainly people that I have met who live that life who would prefer that life to the constraints of like government housing, for example. And I kind of
Mhm.
understand it. I really do. Like, not in the winter time. I think that's a pretty harrowing existence. But this description of this life in this story of these people walking through the steps, it sounds like it's at least late spring, summertime, something. So even though it's cold at night, they have the ability to make a fire. Like they seem like in all aspects other than having food, they were kind of having a good time. And it felt more like I would rather be doing this than toiling on a farm for some rich person that I will never meet and who doesn't care about me, I guess is kind of what I'm getting at. And I do
Yeah,
understand that temptation.
there's nothing weighing them down, and they can
No.
um, I guess there's more dignity in like dying on the steps than being weighed down in a city where you're gonna be choking.
Yeah, I guess in summation, that's what I would say. Yeah. And I think that that stark difference between this one and the lower depths, in a way, raises this story in my estimation a little bit, only
Hmm.
in the sense that it's exploring a similar concept in a vastly different environment and in different enough circumstances that it actually, I think, makes the lower depths feel more tragic by comparison to me. I don't know how you feel because it sounds like you had not read this one before.
Yeah, this was a new read for me.
Mm,
And it's yeah, I can definitely see where like the lower depths characters are more pitiful because they are definitely stuck in that. And um there's the want to change, but there's no deliberate action to escape at that moment anyways. And with these people, they are content kind of being like not on the run, but on the move. And
hmm
that keeps them alive and keeps them well not fed in this case, but um it keeps them satiated in a different way, content.
Yeah, like their escapism is still rooted in reality, whereas a lot of people in the lower depths, even though their experiences that they could experience, so it's not going as far as what Dostoevsky would suggest, they are still more intangible concepts. And I feel like it's just got to be because the physical circumstances of their lives were so much more wretched. It's like if you're going to be starving here or starving there, what do you choose? And I think obviously it's a terrible choice to have to make. But yeah, I guess I'd rather go out looking up at the stars on the steps than looking at the ceiling of like a garret in the middle of this wretched little village. Like,
Yeah,
who wants
the
that?
same Garrett for like a year.
Yeah, like who wants that? And I think that the tragedy is that those are kind of the two choices that most of the people in this part of the world at that time were making, but it is sort of like to me a little bit obvious what the lesser of two evils is there. Even if the end result is the same, and it's still a horrible, horrible death. Like, don't get me wrong, like I don't think it's like romantic, the idea of starving to death looking up at the stars on the steps. But if that's my choice, I guess that's what I would choose. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It was an interesting little story, I think. But again, overall, I would say it was made more interesting by the contrast with the other, I think, better piece. Um, but I'm glad I read it. Like I enjoyed my time with it. Um, I don't know. I did want to know though from you what you made of the fact that the student murders the guy they meet on the steps. Like, what did
Yeah.
you make of that? Because that felt I mean, I didn't dislike that ending, but I just didn't quite know
It
what
was
to
a bit
make.
shocking. It was shocking
Yeah.
because he's, at least to me as a student, to me is supposedly the most innocent archetype of those characters.
Yeah.
But I guess just shows that those types of conditions can corrupt even, the most pure, not the purest of souls, but someone that you wouldn't expect to be capable of such brutality.
Yeah, it felt the most cynical of any of the events that happened in the story, I guess, to me, because it was unnecessary. Like everything else that happened, I think could be justified by desperation, but there was no reason for him to kill that guy. Like none whatsoever. Like he could have robbed him and not killed him. And that would have felt a little bit more. I mean, I still think it's not good. Like you shouldn't do that. But I do
No, of
think it would
course.
be, but I do think it would have been more justifiable, I guess, of like, I needed this money. This guy had it. It was me or him. Survival of the fittest. Like all of that would have made sense. But killing him was so, yeah, it was shocking. I was like, he was kind of dying anyway. There was no reason to do that.
Mhm.
Like, it didn't seem like that guy was going to make it. So, stealing his money, you could have almost justified it that way in your mind of like, well, he was dying anyway. Like, what use was that money going to be to him? And I'd be like, okay, I think that's pretty brutal of an attitude to have, but I get it. But to kill him, and have it come, as you said, from like the more innocent seeming of the three people that you have here. It felt in a way kind of reminiscent of The House of the Dead by Dostoevsky,
Mhm.
where there's this idea of like the crimes you've committed not really necessarily correlating with the type of person that you are. And I think this very much evoked that feeling for me because it was this reversal of expectation that these other two guys, who by all accounts seem like they are more hardened, you know, just world weary, kind of like I've seen it all before type people, are not the ones who engaged in that level of viciousness is an interesting contrast.
I guess it's why Gorky had the student do it because it's the most impactful, and maybe it's also a message to young Russians, contemporary Russians at the time that this could be you. You could be in this
Mhm.
situation. You could be driven to this type of desperation. And
Mm.
how do we get out of this?
Yeah, and I actually felt like it kind of unifies the three people and it unifies an aspect of humanity which is ugly, but I think it kind of again strips back this misconceived idea that class has some sort of parallels with morality or with ethics, because it's sort of like, no, even the like civilized person is going to potentially engage in these uncivilized behaviors under the right circumstances. And I thought that that was a nice, subtle, more subtle class critique as well of like, you're not better than these people. Like, this guy is a criminal, this other guy is like a fallen soldier, and neither of them are engaging in this, but you did. And it could have been any of the three of them, but it happens to be the one who seems through
Above it
common
all,
sense to be the least likely to do it. But I think it kind of breaks that illusion of that type of common sense where it's like, no, you can be very educated and be a horrible person. I mean, again, with the notion that we know that he wasn't probably really a student, but we don't know any different. He's just called the student the whole story. So that's kind of what we're left with, I guess.
what do you think he really was?
I wonder about that,
Yeah,
actually. Um, because it seems like such a weird lie to tell
yeah.
and a
Of all
weirdly
the things you could
egotistic
be,
thing. Yeah, it seems like an almost weirdly egotistical thing to say. It's like, for what reason would you want to create this implied hierarchy that you're at the top of, I guess, in a situation where that hierarchy has no value? I don't know that I know what he was supposed to actually have been, really. I don't know. Did you have some idea about that?
I think it's one of those cases where it could also be um, this character wanted to appear like above it all and wanted to appear, not dirty. I guess you could say
Yeah.
not down in the dirt like with the rest of the ruffians. And maybe it was a similar experience for Gorky being on the road and telling people, "Oh, I'm a writer," you
Mm.
know, something like that, maybe.
Mm. Oh, that's a whole other spicy topic. Yeah, the writer being sort of able to keep themselves above the muck by virtue of being like, oh, I'm like kind of d detached from this. I'm just an observer. I'm not a participant.
Yeah,
That's a spicy topic too. But yeah, no, definitely. I could see that being perhaps why a person would lie, even though it's sort of absurd to lie in this case, like literally for what reason? Like, it's
yeah.
not like it made either of these other two people respect him more or like him more.
There
I
might
don't
be
know.
some shame to it, I think, also with this
Yeah.
type of character wanting to mask themselves.
Mm.
That's how I see it, anyways.
Although, would that not also make him the most fallen of the three of them too, though?
It is sad because they can't own what came before or what makes up their essence. They need to mask it or restructure it in a way
Mm.
and not tell the full story.
Yeah, the soldier character is the only one where I feel like there's this implication of honesty, because even the narrator says at the very beginning, he's like, I know I'm better than other people. Like I know
Mhm.
I think of myself as being better than other people. So I'm not going to talk about this or that about myself. And of course, it's the end. It's revealed that he's telling this story to someone at a hospital. Yeah, at a hospital, So even in that case, he has this need to obfuscate, but the soldier character seemed, at least he's presented to be as he is. And ironically, he seemed also to be the nicest of these three people. Like he seemed the most willing to welcome, I guess, this other traveler who's sick into the fold. And there's that moment where of camaraderie briefly between all of them. Yeah, I think of all of them, the soldier character felt the most capable of what's the word I'm looking for? Of threading the needle of like maintaining your humanity while also adapting to the necessities of your circumstances. Like he's willing to rough the guy up, but then
He's
also
got to do what he
acknowledge
got to
him.
do.
Yeah, but still then afterwards say, but you can join us by the fire. So,
There's this one quote that kind of um, is worth adding to this.
mm,
Folks like us don't care much to speak of their past life, having always more or less good reasons for not doing so. And all of us believed one another, at least apparently, for inwardly each of us had ceased to trust even himself. So I
yeah.
guess would you say that that would be applicable to all three of the characters, that there's this inward sort of shame, or
I
just the student maybe?
I feel like mostly just the student, possibly the narrator as well. Like again, his feeling that he needs to mythologize himself to whoever it is that he's telling this story to, I think speaks to a level of ego that he's not acknowledging in the rest of the narrative. Again, I feel like the soldier kind of sticks out a little bit because we don't really get that from him in any way. Like the narrator doesn't seem to think that he's being disingenuous, the way that he seems to think the student was. Like he seems to kind of just accept that this guy is who he says he is. Um, but yeah, I do find it interesting that even the protagonist in the way he's telling his own story is very upfront about being an unreliable narrator. Um, I always like an unreliable narrator that's upfront about their dishonesty.
Yeah, because it kind of leaves some of the details up for interpretation, kind of like the film Joker. And like, was it all
Yeah.
real? Did that all really
Yeah.
happen?
What it actually made me wonder about a little bit, because I'm like, here you've got this guy who's telling this story who tells you at the very beginning, that he is of dubious honesty in the sense of who he is as himself. It almost made me wonder, I'm like, did he kill the guy? Like, was there a
Mhm.
third person
Yeah.
actually? Or was it just you?
And he
Because
blames the student in his retelling of it,
yeah, it makes me wonder if there was a student because it's
right?
sort of like you could also have just lied. That could have just been you. Because in a way, that would kind of, now that I'm thinking about it, that actually would kind of track to me in the way that he characterizes himself and the parallels between that self-characterization and the characterization of this student as being like, well, was he a student? It's like, why create that ambiguity? For what reason? And it makes me wonder if it wasn't just two guys plus the third guy and then something else happens and maybe that's why they split up because it does seem a little bit wild to me that it would be like, oh yes, and we remained close, the soldier and I, after this incident, and we went on to have many other adventures until incidentally we got separated. I actually wonder if he didn't kill the guy.
It might have been, now that you mention it, because it seems implausible that, like you were saying, that this supposedly more pure character did something so brutal. So maybe it was a manifestation.
It would also make sense, I suppose, thematically too, because I think it would still
Hmm.
fit this idea of like building yourself up to be different than what you are. And it would also make sense, especially if there was some element of truth, like maybe the protagonist was a student or something adjacent to that. And this was his moment of kind of like falling from grace, where it was sort of like, this is the moment that he's revealed to be the type of person who would kill a fellow traveler, I suppose. And maybe he's just trying to reconcile that by putting the blame on this other imaginary projection of himself. I don't know. That's my
Oh,
new hot take is that there was no student. It's just him.
it's your headcanon?
That is my headcanon, and I'm sticking with it.
Okay.
In my fan fiction that I write of this, that'll be the outcome.
So there was
But
a honorable interpretation bonus quote that I wanted to bring up. Um, Misfortune is the strongest cement in the uniting of characters. And I think this is very, very strong for the whole story. That,
mm,
um, and not just this story, but I guess Lower Depths and Gorky
hmm
in general, that the class circumstances and the misfortune brings them together.
hmm Oh yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting too because again, there's a little bit of interplay, right? Because on the one hand, yes, like within this story, so kind of putting aside my notion that there were only two of them, like let's say there are three of them, or plus the other guy. It's like, but for this weird circumstance that they're all after the same thing, which is just survival, they wouldn't be hanging out together. There's no solidarity
Yeah.
inherent in those social positions. And similarly in the lower depths, there's no reason other than desperation that these people have fallen in together. And I think it does speak to that quote of the idea of misfortune cementing people together. I think it also speaks to the idea of humans just being social creatures. Like, we have the odd feeling of like, self-isolation and all of these things, but you see over and over again that people tend to gravitate towards each other when things are difficult, especially. There just seems to be something very human about wanting camaraderie. Actually, in The Count of Monte Cristo, Dumas has this exploration of that a little bit of like, um, suffering is manageable as long as you're not alone in it, but it becomes unbearable if you are the only one suffering and you see everyone else being okay. And I think that I, I think about that sometimes when I think about this type of situation where I'm like, yeah, I think there is a sort of camaraderie within the suffering. And if any one of these people were elevated above that, that camaraderie would break apart immediately.
It kind of brings me back to our conversation earlier about Canadian politics and how the current circumstances have kind of brought Canadians together.
Yeah, definitely. Again, it is. I think there is something weirdly connected about suffering and solidarity.
And
Class
being Canadian,
consciousness, perhaps, and being Canadian. Maybe that was the gag. Maybe the Canadians were the ones that were suffering all along. It wasn't the Russians. Um,
in a lot of areas today, it could be argued.
it could be. One could say, one could suggest. But yeah, no, and I think like rounding it all the way back out,
Hmm.
Gorky's identity as a socialist makes a lot of sense of him taking that position because what is class consciousness if not the coming together of otherwise unrelated groups of people united by oppression and suffering? And so it makes a lot of sense to me that a socialist would land on that being one of the answers, I guess, or one of the solutions to that suffering is within the solidarity of the group, which is why I think this story ending in murder is kind of interesting because that feels a little antithetical to that premise. Like, why would you be a class traitor in that way? So I don't really necessarily know what to make of that. But I think, yeah, the idea of solidarity through suffering with a socialist lens totally makes sense.
I guess the killing sort of just illustrates that even though one is oppressed, it doesn't mean that they're completely pure either.
Yeah. I guess you could say that. I guess the implication is also as well that like it still hurts you ultimately. Um, because I think there is sort of a significance. Like, if we take my interpretation that the narrator is also the one who commits this murder, he ends up alone and in a hospital. So, is he really better off for having done that? Like, was that instance of um, selfishness and individualism something that actually ultimately improves his life? It doesn't sound like it, because it sounds like they were kind of enjoying each other's company up until this incident happens that kind of drives them apart, regardless of what he says of like, oh, we went on to have all these adventures. I'm like, okay, but did you? Or is that sort of like what you wish would have happened?
He's kind of
Because it seems,
justifying it.
yeah, it just feels incompatible. Like it feels incompatible that an act of selfishness would ultimately improve your life. I think that that's very antithetical to a lot of Gorky's beliefs, and so it leads me to again strongly wonder if the narrator was not the one who actually commits this murder, because that would then fall in line a little bit better, I think, to me. Thematically, it would be more cohesive, I think.
I wish we could write a letter to the editor about this one, but he's gone,
I know.
unfortunately.
We're left to wonder.
Maybe
We're
I can write a note and leave it at one of the statues. Maybe I'll get an answer.
Yeah, exactly, right? It kind of reminds me of the that cozy Japanese series When the Coffee Gets Cold. Like that's the premise, is
Mm.
that you get to go hang out with somebody who's dead, but only for the length of time that the coffee is hot.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
we need to go there and talk to Gorky about this and say, listen, I need answers. Did he or did he not kill this guy?
That'd be
And
cool.
Gorky would say, why are you focusing on this? We need to like go
Move
fight the
on.
good fight out in the streets.
Yeah. Why are you obsessing about this detail? It doesn't matter.
Yeah. It matters to
Maybe,
me. It matters deeply.
maybe I can find a Gorky cosplayer on Red Square because there's so many historical personalities that are dressed up down there.
Oh my gosh. That would be so funny, actually.
Mhm.
Oh man. Yeah.
I've
Well,
considered doing a Pushkin cosplay and going down there because I haven't
have
seen
you?
Pushkin yet.
I think that would be amazing. I think that's so fun. I think that's a deeply underestimated form of entertainment, is that kind of role play cosplay thing. I think that's so fun, especially if the person can do it really well and really capture the sort of, I mean, I guess it's inherently a sort of caricatured version of that person, but if you can do it really well, I think it's actually quite a fun thing to engage in. But yeah, you could. You could do real life When the Coffee Gets Cold. It's like coffee with Pushkin.
Yeah, and it's if you know a lot about the personality too, you can talk about it and make these fun jokes, which
Yeah,
makes it much more enriching. I was just
definitely.
having this interesting conversation about this very topic with a student of mine,
Mhm.
contrasting Red Square with Times Square. Where on Times Square, there's all
Mhm.
these uh, characters like Spider-Man
Mm.
and Super Mario and the Smurfs and stuff, and then here on Red Square, you got um, Lenin and Peter the Great, Catherine the Great in costumes. It's an interesting contrast into
Yes, actually.
what's out there.
One could say it's indicative of something.
Yes, I guess what's
Um,
most talked about.
yeah.
We'll have to wait until the George Washington cosplayer shows up in Times Square
Oh
or in
God.
DC. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. So much uncertainty in these troubled times.
Yes, which we will be speaking about more, no doubt, as everything develops. Um,
Absolutely.
but for
But
today,
hopefully,
I'm glad we
yeah.
were able to discuss On the Steps by Maxim Gorky.
Yeah.
Were there any other honorable quote bonuses that you had by chance?
I think you covered most of what I have in my notes. Let me see. Yeah, we kind of talked about that idea of like instinct versus honor. Um, yeah, no, I think we were very much on the same page with
Hmm.
our interpretations of this and what we thought of it. I still can't believe we both thought of Jack London. I think that's so funny. Um,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah,
want to believe that Gorky and London met at some point because Gorky did visit the U.S. So it just feels to me that those two guys must have ran into each other at some
is
point.
that your headcanon?
It's my writer's headcanon that they ran into each other and shared a cup of coffee and maybe traded some notes. Who
Hmm.
knows?
I also choose to believe that, you know. They could have talked about grooming tips. Gorky had quite the mustache.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Maybe they played some tennis together too.
Oh my gosh, did Gorky play tennis? That's so funny.
Maybe I can just imagine Jack London because he's kind of like a country house kind of guy.
Yeah.
So I can imagine Jack London in like a tennis outfit and then inviting Gorky like, here, I have an extra outfit and a paddle, so let's have a game.
Oh my God, not Gorky in the tennis outfit. That's so funny.
Yeah.
On that note,
Yes. On that note, I guess we can.
if anybody
Uh,
wants to commission the fan art of that.
yeah, I would love to see that.
Mm,
Um, yeah. So bringing it to a close,
yeah.
Ren, thank you again for joining us. We can continue our Gorky series because I think there's some more gems that are awaiting us.
I'm excited because, like I said, I always love talking to somebody about an author that they really admire and have really done a lot of the background work for because I feel like it always makes for such an interesting entry point into that person's work to be discussing it with somebody who is so enthusiastic about it and interested in making those connections. So absolutely have me back on. I will read another Gorky with you for sure.
Great. Thank you so much, Ren.
Yeah, take care.